And we're live.
All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the October 29th meeting of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council. Jamie, I'm going to ask you to call the roll, please.
And starting the roll, Secretary Abed.
Present.
Senator Smith. Senator Carter. Senator West. Delegate Clippinger. Delegate Jackson. Delegate Pippy. Secretary Green.
I'm here. Okay.
Ms. Tolentino.
I'm here.
Mr. Kammer.
Here.
Ms. Egan.
Here.
Judge Sam.
Here.
Ms. Douglas. Dr. Gilball.
Present. Good morning, everyone.
Dr. Lawson.
Present. Good morning, everyone.
Dr. Sickmund.
I'm here.
Mr. Bailey.
Here.
Deputy Commissioner Sullivan. Mr. Schellenberger.
Here. Good morning, all.
Ms. Davis. Ms. Mandel. Mr. Dodson.
Here.
Ms. Handy. Mr. Campbell.
Present.
Ms. Chapman.
Present. Good morning.
Mr. Fonseca.
Present.
Mr. Houston.
Good morning.
Ms. Johnston.
I'm here.
Mr. Ford.
Present.
Mr. McGlone.
Good morning. I'm here.
And that's the roll, Mr. Secretary.
Okay.
Delegate
I ask-
Jackson,
Miss Davis.
Delegate Jackson
Yes.
jumped in.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for
Thanks,
joining
Jenny.
us.
Absolutely.
So Delegate Jackson has joined us, and Jenny, you mentioned someone else was not called.
Lynn Davis.
Lynn Davis.
Sorry about that. Do we have Ms. Davis in the room?
Yes, present.
Thank you.
And I did get word from Chairman Clippinger that he would likely be late. So we just need to announce him when he arrives. But let me ask, do we have a quorum?
Yes, we do.
Okay, excellent. All right. Next, we have approval of the meeting minutes. Those should have been emailed out to you. If we could take a moment to review them if you have not, and I'll take a motion to approve.
So moved.
Seconded.
Any opposition to the minutes? Okay, we'll take those as accepted. And before we get into the rest of the agenda, I did want to just announce or go over future meetings, which is number 6 on our agenda. I'm going to pull that up to the top at this point because we have had to move some things around to accommodate the data availability. And we spoke about this a bit in prior meetings. So the youth charged as adults data is now, appears to be flowing, and we should be getting that information, but it will not be in time for the November 19th meeting. So we need to move that back to November 10th. And we'll take that up along with the recommendations for juvenile court jurisdiction as we had packaged those together. So going back to November 19th, what we will have remaining, I believe, will be probation recommendations, because my understanding is that the work group is not yet ready to present those. Is that correct, Betsy?
That's correct.
Okay, so we will have those recommendations to take up for voting. Conceivably, if we get to diversion today, we would have diversion recommendations to take up. And as we left it in the last mix-up of topics, we would have had education then also on November 19th. And then December 17th would be the final date where we would be reviewing a report. So today we have recommendations for pretrial and pretrial detention and commitment. And we have slated presentations on diversion practices. And what I'd like to do is have the discussion on those pretrial recommendations and the out-of-home commitment recommendations today, and if possible, vote on them. And if we can, if we are close to getting to a consensus or something approaching that, and we think we can get those things through, I would prefer to use the time that we have today, hopefully, to get those recommendations voted out. And if we need to, we can bump the presentation on diversion to November 19th. That will leave us, I think, too many topics and too many items to do. And so what I'm proposing is, if we do run out of time, the topic to sacrifice is education. I think when we looked at all of the areas that were important to the council, youth charges, adults, court jurisdiction, probation, diversion, these are things that I think we should not sacrifice. If we need to sacrifice time, it should be around education. I would just like to hear if anybody has any objection to doing that. All right. Hearing no objection, or I don't know, is Melissa, you're talking, but I think you're muted. Did you have something?
I was just sort of mumbling to myself. I don't love it, but you know, it is what it is.
Hey,
I
Sam,
agree
I have
with
a
you.
question.
Sure, Mr. Ford.
This is Eric, yeah. So when you say sacrifice, what does that mean, that the group will not address it at all, or what is it?
Potentially, yes, because we would have to have a presentation on the information and then time to vote on that as well for recommendations. And the reason that I choose, or I'm choosing that particular topic is because we do have within the state education work groups. There's a school to prison pipeline task force. There are other entities that are taking up that issue. And while education is certainly very important, I don't mean to minimize it whatsoever. It is vital to the operation of facilities and the success of kids in the community. There are other groups that are looking at that at those issues. And so that's why, if there is a time crunch, no one else is looking at probation or diversion or youth charged as adults. These are the issues that are directly related to us. And so that's why I've prioritized that. I'm going to ask Rosemary first, and then Dr. Sickman next.
Hi, I feel the same as Melissa does. Education is an extremely important component, and where we as a group and in other groups have identified that the education being delivered to the children, the youth under our care in the facilities is really not what we would like it to be. I just need some reassurance that either the State Advisory Board can take it up and actually make a recommendation that you all will support, or that we work in some legislative way, because these other things are extremely important, and I'm learning a lot all the time. I just don't want that education piece to be lost, because it is so important for all these other things, that while we have these youth in our care, that they get the kind of education and services available to them that they would have if they were in the community in a regular general high school. So I would, that would be my statement. I know you're shocked.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying. And, you know, perhaps we can consider a way, you know, as we've been receiving recommendations and, you know, whether we vote them out or not, there's been some very, very good work done. And I think that at a minimum, we could append proposed recommendations from the State Advisory Board to our report. Even though they may not be voted through the council, they can be included as one of the, you know, appendix that we add because it was a topic that we wanted to take up. Dr. Sigmund?
That would be a good compromise, yes.
I was going to just ask, I mean, maybe rather than taking up the whole topic and presentation and a set of specific recommendations about what to do, can we maybe make a recommendation that these other groups in fact do study it, that, you know, to specifically assign it kind of to other folks, and perhaps at least list the issues that we know we were concerned about, so that nothing falls through the cracks.
Yeah, I think that's a recommendation that, well, obviously we'd have to vote through, but I would support. And that's another approach that we could take. We could certainly do both.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Jackson, thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So the Secretary and I have been working together for quite a while. And this education piece has been something that we have spoken about over the years. You know, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, which also deals with the budget for DJS and public safety as a whole, and education. You know, any recommendations that this group comes up with is something that we could look at for potential legislation, or at least you know, future work group or concurrent work group interest as we move forward. You know, as we've spoken before, Mr. Secretary, and your team, you know, this is vital. You know, that gap between when a young person is detained, whether they've been in school at the time or not, and the matter of how long that young person is in your care. You know, that drop off is often too significant for that young person to get back into the fold when he or she returns. So I'm very much interested in that as well. And I look forward to any recommendation. I look forward to working with anyone, you know, on this council as we move forward. Whether it has to be legislation or not, that can be determined later, but I think it's vital. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Delegate Jackson. And I support the sentiments that are expressed. This is an issue that's very important to me. And in fact, I was one of the people behind the scenes with Vera saying, hey, we need to put this back in here. This is something we cannot miss. So it pains me as much as it pains anyone else here to drop or potentially consider dropping that important of a topic. But we have November 19th, December 10th, and then December 17th to vote on a final report with only 3 meetings and really only the next 2 being substantive meetings where we can have presentations and really take up new information. We're at a time crunch. And so I do like the ideas of having perhaps the State Advisory Board come up with some recommendations that we could take, because they are uniquely, I think, informed about education generally and juvenile services education. And it's a topic I know that Rosemary, you have kept on the front burner. And so, I'm comfortable with what you guys would come up with, and we can take those up without a presentation and vote them up or down. And as I said, in the alternative, or even in an addition, we could also append them to any report that we write. But it's a large topic. There's a lot to do, and it would be difficult, I think, to squeeze all of those in essentially 2 or 3 meetings. So thank you, everybody, for the comments, and we will endeavor to try and keep it if we can. With that, I want to just ask Betsy, is there anything that you want to add to the work group report out, or shall we just move on to the recommendations for pretrial and commitment?
I'll just add that Jenny Egan and I did meet, went over all the recommendations that were presented on probation, and we're just finalizing some language, and we'll be able to circulate that to all the council members prior to the next meeting, so they have time. Jenny, did I miss anything?
Excellent. I think that would be great if we can get those out sooner than later and have time for folks to digest them. Perhaps we can move more speedily to discussion and voting. And with that, I do want to move to discussion and voting on the recommendations that we've received. And we received 4 sets of recommendations, if I'm counting correctly. One from the State Advisory Group Chair, and I assume the whole State Advisory Group, and 2 from the Public Defender, and 1 from the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition. And typically when we've done this, we have the council member that proposed the recommendations present them, and we're going to follow that again today. I'm going to ask Nate Bayless to present the recommendations from the Youth Justice Coalition, because they're not actually a member. The coalition is not, but 3 of our council members are members of the coalition, and Nate being one of them. So I'll call on you last, Nate, to give you a little bit of time to review those and be ready. And we'll start with Eric Ford and the State Advisory Group recommendations.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so I wanted to take time to kind of ground us again to some federal legislation as it relates to the State Advisory Group. I am the chair of the SAG for the state of Maryland. And we haven't talked about it a lot, but there is no centralized national juvenile justice system, as we know, which causes a lot of discrepancies in policies across the country and consistent outcomes. So to address this, in 1974, Congress passed the Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention Act as a way for states to change the way that they look at juvenile justice. Most recently in 2018, with bipartisan support, the JJPA, which is now called the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, JJRA, it was based on a broad consensus of that children, youth, and families involved in the juvenile justice and criminal court should be protected by federal guidelines. The JJRA creates a federal-state partnership for the implementation of juvenile justice. It authorizes each state to have a state advisory group. It kind of covers and oversees federal funding for delinquency prevention throughout the country. It created the OJJDP so that they were dedicated to training and technical assistance, research and evaluation, and of course, then it oversees the 4 core protections for juvenile justice, which is the deinstitutionalization of status offenders, jail removal. Young people should be removed from adult jails, sight and sound separation, and then each state should address racial and ethnic disparities. In Maryland, we have a nationally recognized race and ethnic disparities coordinator. His name is William Jerrigan, who is doing a great job. So that leads to my first recommendation, which is it's imperative that in all of our recommendations and proposed outcomes, we keep as a consideration how to mitigate race and ethnic disparities. As a state, we have not made significant progress in this area. It's one of the ways that we remain in compliance with the federal statute and keep federal funding flowing into the state. So this is something that the national, the OJJDP looks at constantly and makes a determination as to whether or not you will receive federal funding. So when you have a policy with disparate outcomes, it's either an ineffective policy, it's poor implementation of that policy. And if that policy is allowed to persist, a message is being sent that those impacted don't matter. So I submitted a group of articles, and one of the articles was titled Implementing Juvenile Justice Reform. So I made a recommendation that DJS uses this as a guide. OJJDP contracted and consultant to help their reform efforts. That consultant was the National Research Council. And among other recommendations, they strongly encouraged the use of 7 hallmarks of a developmental approach of juvenile justice. In the state advisory group, we use this to evaluate proposals that we receive from organizations who are seeking funding from the state. And those are listed there. I don't necessarily need to go through all 7 of those, but the recommendation is that as a part of DGS's reform, that they adopt these guidelines as a practice. The second article I submitted was titled Juvenile Justice Reform in Connecticut. So I submitted a recommendation to reduce the use of confinement and out-of-home placements. Youth who are considered for commitment and placements should be reviewed by a support team that includes clinicians, family, educators, social workers, and legal representation. This team will review each case and prioritize safe community supports or ensure mental health supports if placement is necessary. And that's connected to when you look at the 7 hallmarks of a developmental approach, number 3 and number 4. So I hope as I go through these articles, it's much more information in these articles. So I hope that people will take the time to review those for more context. The next article, promoting new directions for youth justice. My recommendation was that by reducing the number of youth in detention facilities and out-of-home placements, the state would experience savings that could be reinvested in community-based alternatives. The facilities could be repurposed for job training and workforce development. DGS should consider a continuum of care model to meet the needs of young people. And in that article, it's a whole design that's related to a continuum of care that I think is very strong. And then transforming juvenile probation, a vision for getting it right. This was a article and research conducted by the N.E. Casey Foundation. DGS case managers should change their deficit-based approach to offer more strength-based support and less surveillance. This should include a reduction in lengthy probation orders, fines and fees, and more reliance on familial support, partnerships, and community-based organizations. This is actually a model that we use in the Choice program recently. In the last couple of years, we worked with the Department of Juvenile Services to change our model to shift from one that was deficit-based, heavy on surveillance, to one that was built around helping youth support reach their goals and providing more supports for them. And we found that to be very effective. And then lastly, this wasn't in my submitted recommendations, but I think it's really important that my final recommendation is to provide some structure to future recommendations to this group. We have to get away from opinions and anecdotes and ground our recommendations in 3 things: relevant data, research, and a reduction of racial and ethnic disparities. I call it my 3 R's. Very simple, easy to remember. So these are my recommendations based on 27 years of experience in youth development, my experience of being director of the Choice program that has touched more than 25,000 youth and families for more than 30 years, my position of at the State Advisory Group Chair, and my experience as a Black man who represents the group who has been historically most impacted by race and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. I appreciate the time that you took to put these together. Before we get to discussion, I want to get to the other recommendations as well, and then we can engage in discussion. So next, I'd like to call on Ms. Egan, and you can take them in either way. I know you've got two sets, so I'll leave it to you, which you'd like to do first.
I'm going to start with commitments and placements, as the detention is lengthy and this is a little shorter. So I provided a lot of background and evidence and support for our recommendations. So I'm just going to summarize that to say that Maryland currently spends more than 45 other states to incarcerate a single child. That is just an astronomical figure. As someone who supports children, I'm not opposed to spending on quality care. The problem is that they are not getting quality care and quality programming while they are committed to the Department of Juvenile Services. Maryland's state youth correctional system is violent, isolated, costly, and ineffective. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have seen a dramatic drop in average daily population during COVID. At one point, juvenile prisons in Maryland were down 66% in population, and our DJS youth jail population has dropped about 50%. I think that this presents a historic opportunity for this group, for the Juvenile Justice Reform Council. Right now, Maryland's youth prisons have an average daily population of less than 40 kids. We can do better than what we currently have designed for them. And we know what works: keeping low-level offenders out of youth prisons, supporting young people in their homes and communities, and creating a robust continuum of evidence-informed placements where youth can, for youth that cannot safely remain in their homes. We need to have evidence-based, culturally competent programming. And that means that we can't take all the kids and ship them out to Western Maryland. Because the people in Western Maryland that are staffing these placements don't reflect or understand or come from the communities where our children are experiencing trauma, where they have experienced harm, and where they have been exposed to the things that have led them to the delinquent behavior. So for those reasons, I make the following recommendations. What we know is that 2/3 of kids who are committed for out-of-home placement in Maryland have committed misdemeanors or violations of probation. Those are low-level kids who should never be taken out of their homes, mostly because we know it does more harm than good. It increases recidivism. It leads to them dropping out of school and lack of school completion. It simply is counterproductive. So my first proposal is that we recommend prohibiting youth who are adjudicated delinquent for misdemeanor offenses and violations of probation from being committed for out-of-home placement. My second recommendation is that we establish a plan to close DJS-run youth prisons and create regional, community-based alternatives to incarceration. We believe that we should, my recommendation is to follow something like the New York's Close to Home initiative, which over the last decade has closed upstate. New York City has closed its upstate youth prisons and created small community-based options that serve kids in the neighborhoods and places where they are when they have to come out of their own homes. I also think that in order to do that properly, we need to require all DJS-run youth facilities and all DJS contracted facilities to employ evidence-based, culturally competent programming focused on positive youth development. We need to establish requirements for adequate clinical, medical, mental health, and positive youth development for staff who have necessary education, training, and background in these fields. What we know about DJS's workforce is that for the most part, they come out of a corrections background and not out of a youth development and adolescent development. We need to require, and maybe this touches on education, we need to require access to comprehensive educational programming, and we need to improve the education available in DJS facilities and that brings me to the last recommendation, which is that every DJS facility and contracted program should be required to offer technical and vocational education training with highly qualified teachers and on-the-job training. So those last two ones are related to education. So those are mine around commitment. I can also address detention and youth jails. Again, this is a very costly system. Most children who are detained in Maryland spend the night in concrete cells. I would ask everyone to look at the Attorney General's Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit pictorial report from 2011, so they get a sense of where our children are actually being kept. These are cells. They sleep on metal beds. Many brush their teeth in steel sinks attached to toilets. They also use to relieve themselves. For putting our kids in cells, we spend between $575 and $1,000 a day. To incarcerate a child in a Maryland youth jail, we spend more in 1 year than we do in their entire K through 12 education. This approach to youth jailing just simply does not work. And we have a number of inadequacies that we need to address in detention. I made, I think, 22 recommendations around this because the detention statute is just very complicated and needs to be clarified. Some of the highlights of those recommendations are to change the requirement. Currently, children are guaranteed a hearing the next court day, but we've had examples where there's been a snow day and a holiday, which has meant that a kid has sat in jail without a probable cause finding for 6 days. Kids often sit for 3 and 4 days. We think that that violates the Constitution and Gerstein v. Pugh. So we think that the statute needs to be clarified to change next court day to within 48 hours of their detention to bring it in line with the requirements of federal case law. And we think, most importantly, that DJS should be required to provide quality evidence-based programming for detained youth for at least 3 hours on school days and 6 hours on non-school days. Currently, there is a severe lack of programming, and kids in jail right now play cards. And I don't know if you know, but teenagers playing cards leads to a lot of conflict. And without quality and quality programming every day, our kids are just sitting. They're being warehoused in cages, and it does not help, especially since we know 70% of our, around 70% of our kids have a diagnosable mental health problem or issue. I also think that in line with, if we're not taking kids out of their homes, and if we don't think that they should go to youth prisons for misdemeanors and violations of probation, then we should bar detention for those offenses. We should clarify language to specify detention cannot be indefinitely extended in 30-day increments. The implementation of the detention statute is very different across the state, and the interpretation is very different because there are conflicting statutes. So we need to clarify and clean up that language. I have suggestions for how to do that. Since COVID, we've been reviewing detention every 14 days for young people. I believe that that should be codified into our current statute. If children are detained, we believe DJS should be required to develop a community release plan for the young person within 10 days. So DJS is the group that's tasked with making a recommendation about detention. But we should also think that there should always be a viable plan, and that DJS, if they plan to detain a child or recommend that they be released, that they present a plan for how to do so, and that every young person has someone working on how to get them home safely. Restrict the use of manual restraints. We think that no child should ever be put in solitary confinement. We think there should be a ban on solitary confinement, as well as limiting and clarifying the language in the detention statute around self-harm, public safety, and leaving the jurisdiction of a court. Currently, the idea of failures to appear is imported from adult court and imposed on young people, despite the fact that 13, 14, and 15-year-olds can't drive and don't have full control over their environment. Failure to appear, if a parent or guardian has failed to ensure their appearance, should be tasked to the parent or guardian and not held against the child. We also believe that we need to create definitions and limits of community detention. Currently, community detention is total house arrest. There needs to be a robust continuum of community supervision options so that every child is not being held on total house arrest in their homes. And we believe that DJS should be mandated to abide by their validated risk assessment instrument. Currently, DJS overrides the D-RAIS recommendation, or an objective recommendation, often. And we think that they should be asked to abide by that when it recommends release or an alternative to detention. I could go through all the rest of these, but I also don't want to take too much time. So I just wanted to check in, Secretary Abed, if I should keep going or if I should, sorry, it's 22 recommendations. It's very,
Yeah, I think there are a number of recommendations here, but I think go ahead and keep going through
Okay.
those, and so we can have them on the table. And I think when we go to vote, we're going to need to do that anyway. So
great. And 13 repeats recommendation number 1. So that, I apologize for that oversight on my part. We have to limit the use of electronic surveillance and community detention for children on probation and for pretrial. The amount of money that DJS spends on electronic surveillance of children is astronomical. And it's not just that that's the cost, right? There's an opportunity loss there that DJS's budget should be going to actual quality supervision and programming for children. And instead what it's being used to do, and just an enormous amount of money to make sure they stay in their homes. And what our kids need are opportunities, not control and compliance-based forms of supervision. So we have to limit the use of electronic surveillance and community and house arrest for children, especially children on probation. If those children are not qualified to be taken out of their homes, it also means that they should not be having their liberty restricted or being imprisoned in their homes. We can't simply move the idea of youth detention and prisons and impose that in children's homes. One, because homes are not necessarily always the safest place for children, but two, because it doesn't fix the problem and it doesn't give them the opportunities that we know probation should be focused on. We need to specify limits on secure detention and community detention post-disposition. The statute is not clear on it, and it leads to a lot of different interpretations, including the time limiting how much a child can be detained pending placement. We need to require DJS to provide access to mental health services for all young people, not only those in acute or a crisis situation. Currently, young people are not getting mental health treatment. They're able to access mental health treatment only in crisis or after a bad incident, right? So after a fight, or if they express suicidal ideation. We need comprehensive mental health services for our children to access 24/7, and we should have mental health professionals on all sites 24/7. We need to mandate DJS increase the number of shelter beds available to young people, especially for young women. Often our courts are making young people eligible for shelter, and yet they languish in detention because there are not enough beds. I don't know that we've ever seen the numbers, but I do believe that they are very high. The days that children spend in detention waiting for shelter beds. That's someone who the court doesn't believe should be in detention, should be in a shelter, but there's simply not enough room for them. We have to establish minimum standards for detention center staff training and require functioning security camera systems in all areas of all DJS facilities. Establish minimum standards for family engagement. Currently, a child taken out of their home is only guaranteed 2 10-minute phone calls a week. Can you imagine being a child, first time you've ever spent any significant time away from your family, you are put into a cell and allowed to call your mom twice a week? There should be daily family contact, at least the opportunity for it. And we need to require and define standards for defense counsel access to young people at every juvenile jail facility, clarify the statute that bars detention for children found not to be competent to proceed. If a child is not competent to proceed, they should not be locked in a cage. And we need to adopt a cognitive behavioral therapy curriculum and restorative justice training for all staff at detention centers. That's my spiel.
thank you, Ms. Egan. So we're going to move to Mr. Bayless. If you could present the recommendations, and as I read them, they were not exactly the same as some of the ones that Ms. Egan presented, but there were some variations. So anyway, Nate, if you could present those.
Sure, and I can speak to the variation. Let me just start by saying it's a privilege to be able to present these on behalf of the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition. My organization is one of the members of Maryland Youth Justice Coalition, the Annie Casey Foundation. But this is my first year that I've actually been myself participating, and I'm really glad that we submitted recommendations because this is a group of organizations that really run the ideological spectrum and a focus that's very local, very statewide and national. The groups have everyone on the council received the recommendations. So if you're not familiar with the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition, I would encourage you to look because people are bringing very different perspectives to the table, and this is where they land based on that. So I'm really excited that we were able to do that. But broadly, it's a group of organizations that are advocating for a more equitable justice system, legal system for young people in Maryland that not only protects their rights, but promotes opportunities for them. So I'm glad we were able to do this. I can run through the recommendations. I want to say, I think there's one recommendation in particular that is different than what was just presented on top of it, and that is to prohibit out-of-state placement for youth, especially young women, except in cases where the regional location will benefit the youth, to build up programs in Maryland based on our population's needs and support rehabilitation close to home. So I want to start with that one just because I don't believe that was in the other recommendations, and I think that's an important one in establishing what some of the other recommendations are really about here. I want to begin with the first recommendation that we have, which I think was not surprisingly also the first recommendation from Ms. Egan, which is to prohibit youth who are adjudicated delinquent for misdemeanor offenses and violations of probation from being committed for out-of-home placement. To me, this is central. I think one of the reports that Ms. Egan linked to in her recommendations was something that my colleagues at the Andy Casey Foundation wrote several years back about the doors to commitment in Maryland. And one of the things that's really interesting is to see the trends in recent years, and this year in particular in Maryland, where there's been a lot of progress in reducing the use of confinement in Maryland, and how it depends on the practices that are happening on any given day and any given year. But from a policy perspective, it's not there. And many other states have done far more to restrict who can be committed to state custody. And here, just as the trends have gone down, they could very easily go back up because we're not doing anything to prohibit young people with misdemeanors or violations of probation from being locked up. We're not even doing anything legislatively to discourage it because we don't have anything there that incentivizes keeping young people home. So I think this is a very important one to begin with. From there, I think that there's already been established talking about having a regional community-based model of placement, ensuring that every county has access to non-residential community-based services that employ evidence-based, culturally competent programming. I think this is also just, again, the editorial commentary here in explaining it. I think when close to home in New York has been referenced. Close to home in New York can sometimes be understood as meaning closing facilities that are far away and instead putting young people in facilities that are close to home. That is not what that initiative was about at all. It was about removing young people from state-based facilities that were far away from where they were living and building a continuum of services that support young people in their homes. And if they can't be in their homes, then to have something near where they live that is a residential program that helps them promote growth and help them still access opportunities, educational opportunities in the neighborhoods or in close to where they live. But it is not about moving kids from far away out-of-home placements to local out-of-home placements. That's not what it should be. And it's important that this recommendation really highlights that distinction. The last few I'll just run through quickly because I know we want to move ahead, but requiring all facilities that house Maryland's youth residents, both department run and if they're contracted, to employ evidence-based programming that's focused on positive youth development, to establish requirements for adequate clinical, mental health, and positive youth development staffing that includes necessary education, training, and background in education, child development, social work, or equivalent fields. And finally, I know we talked about this before, but requiring access to comprehensive educational programming for young people in custody. And I will stop there.
Okay, thank you, Nate, for presenting those. And given that we have essentially two sets of recommendations that are close, in their language and in the spirit of what they're doing. Perhaps we can take those up together, or maybe just take up one of them first, and then if there's anything that was missing, we can take it up in the other. But I would like to start discussion, and I'll start with this Maryland Youth Justice Coalition document that we just looked at, and open it up to the floor for discussion on the specific points that are in here. And I'll just begin the discussion myself. I know when we look at prohibitions for kids that are adjudicated for misdemeanors, prohibitions of incarceration, I think is generally what we're looking at here. I think we talked about out-of-home placement, but it came up in both the detention and the committed portions of these presentations. The sticking point generally falls around the gun offenses. And we do have some gun offenses that are labeled misdemeanors. So let's go ahead and just put that on the table right now. And Betsy, I'm gonna call on you. There are a number of gun offenses that are misdemeanors. Do you happen? Well, she's looking them up right now. You're going to find that list, and perhaps we can see what those are and start the discussion there. And does anybody want to have first crack at comments on that? All right, well, while we're waiting for that, my thought is, when I worked in Virginia, there wasn't a complete prohibition on committing kids for misdemeanors, but there was certainly restrictions on it. And my recollection of the statute in Virginia was that you could not commit a youth for a misdemeanor offense, any misdemeanor offense, a single misdemeanor offense or a single occurrence. So in other words, if you had, a kid that committed a trespass and stole something, a small amount, and assaulted somebody in one occurrence, that was one misdemeanor occurrence. And that there was a prohibition on committing for that. And you would have to have 3 separate and distinct misdemeanor occurrences before you could engage in any thought of commitment. So I say that to say that this is not an extreme position. This is something similar is out there in other places. And I think the biggest, sticking point has always been these gun offenses. And would it be possible to make an exception for just those gun offenses and ban all misdemeanors otherwise to overcome this issue? So I'll call on Melissa first, and then Mr. Schellenberger.
Well, I have a question and then maybe a comment. In statute, what is the purpose for detention? If it's to prevent future offending while cases are pending, then I will just comment that current offense is a really lousy predictor of that. So even the weapons offenses, do something else. It's up to the adults, it's up to the system to figure out ways to support youth in the community without getting into trouble. That's our job, to figure that out. If the community doesn't have the supports currently, then that's where the effort and the money should go. Because current offense is a really, really bad predictor. And you're going to overestimate the risk and lock way more kids up than you need to. It's just the way it tends to work.
Thank you, Dr. Sickman. Mr. Schellenberger.
So what am I supposed to do when the 16-year-old has been found with a gun twice? You may say that that's not a great predictor, but in my world, it is a great predictor. And because if I wait for the third time, does somebody get shot or does he get shot? Look at what's happened in Baltimore City this year. How many juveniles have been murdered? And how many of them have been murdered who also had a weapon with them? So, it's not just protecting the public. There is a factor in here. And that's one of the things that I mentioned to the staff with Ms. Egan's, some of her approaches, and Mr. Ford, and that is, there can be an exception for public safety, but what about adding to that, or for the protection and safety of the youth? Because that should be a factor. But Dr. Sigmund, what am I supposed to do when a 16-year-old has been caught more than one time with a handgun? Everybody doesn't realize that the majority of time.
Different than just the current offense. That's a pattern of behavior that may be a little bit different. But also you could look to things like back in the mid-90s when violence was way more of an issue than it is right now, even in Baltimore. In Boston, the Boston Gun Project managed to reduce juveniles being killed by guns and killing people by guns. And they didn't do it by locking the kids up in detention. That was not the strategy.
Well, what was the strategy? What do I do with them?
They had, so you can look to the work of David Kennedy, and you can, it is a whole conglomerate of stuff where prosecutors from all levels of government, federal, state, local, police, got together. It was very much gang associated, and they brought the key actors in, the people that are the very high level repeat offenders, and basically said, look, we're coming after you and you better stop it. And, there's a lot more details to how they implemented all of that, but it wasn't just lock up any kid that has some low level weapons offense.
Well, I would ask that if we do make this exception for misdemeanors, and look, Sam, I'm not putting people in confinement who are charged with trespassing or with shoplifting. But I do think we need to look at an exception when we're talking about multiple handgun offenses. I think it not only protects the public, but there's an element of protecting the juvenile.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. And I see Miss Egan raising her hand. I'm going to call on her next, and I'll just say, I can't see everyone's. I'm trying to flip through the screen. So if I don't call on you, just unmute your mic and say something. Miss Egan.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify, because I do believe that the only time that gun misdemeanor offenses, or that gun crimes are misdemeanor offenses, is when no weapon has been used in an additional crime, that possession is the only misdemeanor gun offense.
That is correct.
Okay. So I just wanted to clarify that for the group. I know me and Scott, or me and Mr. Schellenberger, apologies. But Mr. Schellenberger raises some good points. What I would do with a 16-year-old who has been found with a gun twice but has not used it in any additional crimes, what I want to do is find out what that child is afraid of. And when we look at the current status, people often use Baltimore City's murder rate as a boogeyman. And I just want to clarify, the juvenile homicide clearance rate in the late 90s, as Dr. Sigmund referenced, was 25%. Which means that 25% of homicides that were adjudicated had a juvenile who was accused of being a part of the crime. The juvenile clearance rate in Baltimore City is below 3%, which means that young people are not driving the murder spike in Baltimore, people under the age of 18. It's just not true in terms of the clearance rate. But
what's the actual clearance rate? It's lower now.
The
overall clearance rate is lower, so juvenile is going to be lower.
No, but the percentages you would think would map and be approximately the same, right? Because it's a percentage of the cases that are cleared. So it's still apples to apples in terms of that. But in addition, what's happening in Baltimore is that people are afraid, and young people are carrying weapons who have no intent or purpose of or ever using them. So to pretend that all young people who have weapons or who carry guns are out there committing crimes or doing anything other than fearing for their own lives in a city where there is a very low clearance rate, what we want to do is treat those kids. What we want to do is talk to them and find out and get to those underlying causes of violence and really help make those kids more safe. What we know is sending them to detention and out of home placements exposes them to more negative peers, brings them deeper into gang involvement, and disconnects them from education and school. So the answer to locking up a kid on his second gun offense, for me, means that you're going to guarantee a third, and that detention and the use of out-of-home commitments are actually driving that problem rather than addressing the underlying causes. That being said, I think there's room for compromise, especially around a carve-out for guns. So I think there's room.
This will be my last statement for 15 minutes, I promise, Sam. but Dante Harris was being treated by the system when he ran over Officer Amy Caprio and killed her. So, you know, there's got to be a place for other things.
Okay, so what I
Can you
heard
hear
from
me?
Can I just respond to that real quick? Because I know that that's just like a one-shot reference there, like to that. But I think that that's exactly the problem. We can, in not just Maryland, but everywhere, we can look to case after case after case of young people who have been sent to incarceration, who have been detained unnecessarily. And we know from the data that it increases the likelihood that they will come out and hurt somebody on the other end. And to talk about one case where a young person was in the community, of course, that nothing here is about perfection. And this is human behavior, and there's no magic solution. And so I think in talking about what do we do for a young person who has a second gun offense, the answer is individualizing. And that's why I appreciate to say, talk to the young people. What is it that they're scared of? Why are they carrying the gun? And programs that are based on that idea of understanding what's behind the behavior, as opposed to reacting to what is the offense itself. It's the same thing if it was a minor offense, if it was something like drugs, and saying, well, he caught with a bag of marijuana, he must need drug treatment. But having marijuana in session could mean 100 different things, and it can't be one solution. It's the same thing for this. And so I appreciate the point, but I think that we need to be very careful in terms of using individual cases to then make a broader point, because that has been a tactic that has been used around this country for a long, long time to have us be fearful of what happens when we keep young people in the community. And yet we have so much research that talks to the genuine danger that's posed when we lock people up and we fail to address the underlying issues that led to that behavior in the first place that got them there.
May I say something really quickly?
Yes, Missy, I'm sorry, who am I? Can you just say your name? I can't see everybody.
Jill, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So I just want to reiterate what Nate and Jenny said in response to Scott's point, but I also want to emphasize that it's problematic to have a knee-jerk reaction just to a gun being charged as a crime, whether it be a misdemeanor or a felony. And the reason that I say that is throughout the course of my career, overwhelmingly, the number of times that young people and older people are charged with guns, it's not usually, more often than not, it's even a situation where it's a constructive possession, you know, whether it be a misdemeanor or a felony. We know that if a young person or any person is in a home or a car or any place that's in close proximity to drugs and a gun, they're going to be charged with the felony of drug trafficking, as well as the use of a gun in a drug trafficking crime. And I would say that the overwhelming amount of times we're talking about that they're physically present, but may or may not have any high level of culpability in the offenses that are there. And so the point I'm making is that, yes, the misdemeanor possession is something we should look at, but I'm also stressing that we should not just automatically assume that even if it's a initial felony charge, that is something that should be exempted, because, you know, there is our laws allow for people to be charged with things that are much worse than what their actual involvement is so often. And one of the greatest examples is this use of a gun in the commission of a crime of violence or drug trafficking crime. It's charged whenever there's drugs and whenever there's a gun. It could be a 5-room house. The person could be visiting, there's a raid or something like that, and they're swept up, everyone is in there. And even, you know, in some jurisdictions like Baltimore City, even a child in a house with a bunch of adults with no known involvement is going to get those same charges. It can be automatically charged as an adult. So that's my 2 cents, that I want to move away from having a knee-jerk reaction to just the word gun, just the charge of anything to do with a gun. And as Nate said, we need to individualize the responses that we have and not just have this broad category of lumping gun first time, second time, third time. And then also, I would also stress that, not that anybody needs to hear it necessarily, but what Jenny said is true. People are afraid, and if any one of us, if any of us don't, but if we did live in certain communities, there is no way in the world that we would feel safe for ourselves or for our children, or for our parents and grandparents without having some mechanism to protect ourselves, whether it's obtained legally or not.
Thank you, Senator Carter. Is there any other discussion on this before I make any comments? It seems to me that we have, at least it looks to me like there is consensus that aside from the gun issue, that a prohibition on committing youth for misdemeanor or probation violations exists. Am I seeing that?
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I guess my question on the violation of probation, are we talking about for incarceration because of a violation of probation where the underlying delinquency was a misdemeanor?
Well, I think it's broad and it just says on a violation of probation. I would ask maybe one of the Ms. Egan, if you could respond to that.
For me, my proposal is a violation of probation, even on a felony, in that if there is an underlying violation of probation that is a new offense, that could be that the child should be adjudicated and committed on the new offense, but not simply for violating their probation. So violations of probation on felony offenses can include not going to school, missing an appointment. All the levels of violation of probation, I don't think that anything barring a new offense should lead to an out-of-home commitment. So no, it's not limited to misdemeanor offenses.
What about contact with a sexual assault victim?
If it would constitute a new offense, I don't think that should lead to an out-of-home commitment.
You've been ordered by a judge not to have contact with somebody you sexually assaulted, and you have contact, and we can't do anything about that?
I think there are a range of responses and sanctions and ways to address that behavior short of putting a child in a cell.
I would tend to agree that incarcerating kids for misdemeanors, I don't believe it is appropriate. I think my concern is with, and I did hear you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, about setting aside the issues related to guns, and I think that's still an issue that we're going to need to discuss. But I am hesitant to take that away in cases where they may have violated probation because of and the underlying crime was a felony. I'm concerned that in the cases if they had contact, particularly if it was a sexual assault, and admittedly, I mean, in this case, at least, it would be a sexual assault that remains in the juvenile system, at least under current law. I'm very uncomfortable with that. But I mean, the thing that I have seen and I've heard a lot about and makes sense to me is sort of the process offenses and kids who get locked up because they failed to go to school, because they failed to report on time. I think that isn't helpful, and that's not helpful in getting the kid turned around. So and if it's I guess so. That's broadly where I am. I'm in the back of my head. One of the other things that Mr. Secretary, and then I will shut up. And Betsy's raising her hand, waving frantically. The other thing that what you mentioned from Virginia, that if you have a kid who has had 3 or more misdemeanors, that maybe that option would be out there. I'm not so sure that we want want to borrow that, but in the back of my mind, I wonder if there aren't certain cases. I'll just say this. Ultimately, well, I'll reserve the other thing I wanted to say was going back to a gun, to the gun stuff. So I'm going to put my gun comment on the side, but I'm fundamentally a little bit uncomfortable saying that if you've been found delinquent of a felony and there's a VOP, maybe it's not the missing school, but certainly if it's on contact or other more serious VOPs, I think that option should be available.
You could adopt the Justice Reinvestment Act model and say, thank you, Betsy, and say, if it's a technical violation, and we could define those like not going to school and several things like that, and saying you can't incarcerate them for technical violations. And JRA adopted that. In the adult system, you limit the amount of jail, but in the juvenile system, you could say if it's a technical violation that they can't be incarcerated. But then that would leave room for Luke's example for not being technical, and therefore, and again, I have to prove to a judge that there's a violation, and the juvenile has a defense attorney. So again, this is not these automatic things, although Ms. Egan is correct. It might take a day or two before we get in front of the court, and some of the ideas that there are about having quicker hearings, I'm not opposed to. But we could adopt the technical violations as being non-incarcerable. And I didn't make it 15 minutes, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. I didn't expect you to wait 15 minutes anyway. Betsy, go ahead.
So yeah, I think Mr. Schellenberger and I are on sort of the same page. I just wanted to point out what the adult statute already sort of defines as a technical violation. And a technical violation means any condition of probation that does not include a new offense, a new arrest, violation of a no contact or stay away order, or complete absconding. And they also further on define absconding as does not include just missing an appointment. So I think we can build upon, as Mr. Schellenberger said, some of the things that we saw the Justice Reinvestment Act sort of forward and put into Maryland law for adults. There's a lot of protections there. They even referenced evidence-based services, really defining where we should be using this most, high-level interventions of taking young people out of their home. We should just sort of learn a little bit what we saw in the adult system and provide those same protections.
Okay, Senator West.
Yeah, I'm also concerned about this issue of repeated misdemeanors. It seems to me if a teenager, if the word gets out in the community that repeated misdemeanors cause nothing more to happen to you than a slap on the wrist, and you cannot be incarcerated for repeated misdemeanors, what's going to stop out of control kids from simply going out and repeatedly acting out in public on the streets? What if we don't have incarceration as a possibility in those situations, what do we have which would prevent the teenagers from continuing to offend?
I would challenge Senator Chris West. I would challenge that question and also ask, what are you doing currently that is keeping the juveniles that are reoffending quite frequently now? It's the same thing. Like, our juveniles have a mind of their own, and they just need the support with the community to give them other options or other outlets in order to kind of sort of stretch out and be able to expand and learn new things. And so then right now we don't have anything in place to kind of sort of stop that revolving door right now.
I would suggest that that you could have a situation where a kid in the neighborhood is just a problem and commits one problem after another. And if the neighbors find that no matter what he does, he's back on the street that afternoon, you're going to have a lot of disrespect for the law in the neighborhood, and elected officials are going to get complaints.
Ms. Egan, you were going to make a comment?
Yeah, if I may. One,
Please.
what we know is that incarcerating that child will actually lead to more misbehavior. So incarcerating that child leads to greater levels of recidivism than leaving them in the community. So the idea or the proposition that incarcerating them stops that behavior is proven false by evidence. So my question is how do you stop that behavior? And the answer is really good programming, right? And right now, the extent that we are relying on detention and commitment for these misdemeanors, for low-level 1-2 time misdemeanors, is taking away from the opportunity and treatment and engagement of that child who may be a larger problem, right? Who is falling deeper and deeper into the system. I just want to bring up that opportunity cost. Not banning out-of-home commitment for misdemeanors is why we don't have robust community supervision and training and continuum of care to address kids with deeper needs. So we have to think about it in fiscal terms as well. But then the other answer is what we know about young people is that they grow out of misbehavior. They do. And that addressing that behavior and finding out why that kid is acting out is the clearest way to get it to stop. Incarceration is the easiest and clearest way to make sure it keeps going.
How do you force a kid to submit to, quote, really good programming, to use your phrase, if you have no ability to put them in a residential setting?
Nate, I saw that, and Dr. Sigmund wanted to talk, so I don't.
Okay, I'll call on Dr. Sigmund then.
Oh, I was just, I mean, as point of clarification, I think, some of our discussion has really focused on detention, sort of pre-adjudication or disposition. And then every now and then comments come in that sound to me more like an issue around commitment, which, we may be talking about wanting to have that statement about not incarcerating or not putting in placement even misdemeanors, but I think that we need to sort of distinguish the two.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Sigmund, for bringing that up. I was going to mention that as well. The proposal that's currently being considered is for commitment. We're not yet. I know that there is a similar proposal for the detention piece, but this is for commitments at this time. So let's try to limit our discussion to the committed statute. And Nate, did you have Mr. Bayless, a comment?
We still can't hear you.
We're not hearing you. I don't know if there's a problem with your mic.
Sorry.
There you go.
I thought, sorry. I did the double mute thing when you got two kids running around here. It's just the only safe way to do it. So I just want to say, I think it's an important question. And I think, again, that our job, and I think this came up a couple of times, it's on us as the adults, as the system, to be trying to understand why a young person would be behaving in that way, and to make the extreme action of incarceration, again, given what we know the impact of that is on all the things that we would imagine would be the pathways to different behavior, of building good relationships with positive adults and positive peers, to have access to education, recreational opportunities, to improve relationships with parents. Like, all of those things are things that can only happen in the context of community. And I understand that there may be times when, because the behavior is so severe and because the risk to community safety is so great, that we might need to have a young person be removed from his community for some amount of time. But that ought to happen. That's an extreme response given everything that we're talking about. So I totally appreciate the point that says, what do we do when they just won't listen? I mean, we all deal with that in our own lives. What do we do? And sometimes we don't have a satisfactory answer at that moment. But that's why we work on individual young people. And that's why we have a range of things. That's why we don't say the choice program is the only thing that we can throw at it, or the only thing we can do is to send them to YAP, or the only thing that we can do is to have them in this program. That's why we need to address the individual situation. So I think it's an important point, because it's real. Like, it is real that there are young people who continue to do the same thing, and we tear our hair out and go, why? And Ms. Egan is exactly right that everything tells us that that is exactly the kind of behavior that young people will grow out of naturally. And what we're trying to do is help them navigate to that space safely and to teach them new things and ways to change behavior in the long term so that we're not creating problems down the road. And locking them up is sort of it might feel right in the moment, but we don't have anything that tells us that that provides the reactions that we're looking for.
Nate, what you say sounds terrific, but I don't think that if the kid is terrorizing a neighborhood, that the neighbors are going to be satisfied. Hearing the response, we can't do anything. We have nothing that we can do to take him out of the neighborhood. He's going to continue to live in that neighborhood, and we hope that we can understand his problem, but that's about all we can do, because the neighbors won't accept that. And they shouldn't have to accept that. You don't want to have your neighborhood terrorized by a kid who's out of control.
Mr. Kammerer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm interested in whether Ms. Egan and Mr. Bayless would, if someone were to make a motion to adopt their proposal as modified by the JRA, no detention for technical violations, would they object to that? Because I think that gets to Senator West's problem of new violations not resulting in detention. We're talking.
So,
go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Kammerer, I just want to just say we're talking about the out-of-home placement. So what we're talking about here is we've had a trial and we've adjudicated this young person delinquent, and now we're going to say, because you've committed this misdemeanor, we're going to put you in, as well, we say for treatment, but we know that when you lock someone up, it's punishment. We're going to put you into the one of these youth facilities for that misdemeanor. So this is we're not talking about detention. We're not talking about what happens pre-trial. And so I think when we need to keep that in perspective, because when we're considering kids and sort of violations of probation, the immediate response to violations can be detention, and so that can be another conversation. But what we're talking about here is putting you into a committed program, which is akin to being in prison in the adult system. And so this is a bit different than some of the conversation. So I just want to bring it back to that. We're talking about out-of-home placement, which is a commitment. And again, I share your sentiments about the technical violations language. If we do have language in the adult statute that gives protections that prohibits violations of probation from violators from going to prison, with those exceptions that were described by Ms. Tolentino, I think we may have something that we can work with. But you addressed it to Mr. Bayless, and I want to let him or Ms. Egan respond.
I just directly, if that was a thing, I think it is the technical violation that is the biggest issue, for sure. We've already made the decision that this young person can safely be in the community. They haven't demonstrated now that that's changed somehow, and that instead they're just violating conditions that don't address the issue about safety. Then that's the issue. So if to the point of the examples that were given, I think that's a totally different situation than what we're talking about, at least from the standpoint of, could we then could we lock a kid up because of that? I think it's a different situation. So I think technical violations is the thing for me personally that I would say is the issue.
So I'm going to ask Ms. Tolentino. I'm sorry, Jenny. Did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I was just going to say I agree. I think that's a compromise amendment that is very workable.
I'm going to ask Ms. Tolentino to draft while we're speaking. I want to move on to another recommendation, but draft a proposal that we can take up today, articulating the standard that you just mentioned in your comments. And we can take that up as a motion. And so I'm going to give you a few moments to do that. And I want to move on to number 2 on this list, which was to establish a plan to create a regional community-based model of incarceration, ensure every county has access to non-residential community-based services that employ evidence-based, culturally competent programming. So, when I read this, I don't see anything in here that is offensive to me as the secretary of the department. I think that is a model that we want to move to, which is to keep youth closer to their communities. That's something that has been a policy statement, although we haven't really made progress in that respect. And then, the only issue that I would even raise here is on evidence-based, which I think is the standard that we should always be reaching for. But I understand that there have been, sort of research-based, and I'm going to, I think research-informed was the term I heard Dr. Sickman use in the past. My only concern would be limiting us to those things that reach that gold standard and not being able to use some things that are sort of up-and-coming strategies. And so if somebody were to move this, I would ask that we amend it slightly to say that the community-based services that employ evidence-based or research-informed, culturally competent programming. And otherwise, I think it looks pretty good to me. Mr. Kemmerer.
I defer to Dr. Sigmund, but I was just going to move that the recommendation be amended and adopted.
Yeah, I was just going to say other states have developed kind of a matrix of what it takes to be funded by the state or, to be used. State of Washington also has a very comprehensive mechanism for jurisdictions, agencies to try new things and then collect the evidence so that they may become acceptable. So I would suggest that you implement something like that, where you allow innovation, but you have a requirement that things be tested and they can't just be perpetually in place without evidence that they work.
Sure. Ms. Egan?
Yeah, I was going to say that in order to do that and allow for that flexibility, there has to be a framework and oversight. So it simply can't be the agency saying that this is evidence-based. You can't just say it, right? There has to be a way to measure that. And I do believe that rubric that Dr. Sickman referenced was a part of our probation recommendations as well. So I hope that potentially putting that framework in place when we report out from that group could provide that. And with that, I also support that amendment, Secretary Abbott. I think that it's important for innovation and for to bring along programming that we know works but doesn't yet have access to verification or access to the technical process of proving its effectiveness yet.
If I could impose on you, Ms. Egan, if you've got language that you've been looking at, perhaps I could ask you to draft a revision to that to incorporate what you just mentioned, and then we could take that up in a moment as well. And while I have you working on that, and I'm sorry, because I know you are interested in all of these recommendations, but just in the sake of time, let's move on to number 3. Unless there are anyone else that want to comment on this yet?
I was just going to add Pennsylvania's using a slightly different process. They're using the work of Mark Lipsy and his standard program evaluation protocol, the SPEP, to assess programs to see if they are behaving like programs that we know are effective, as an alternate way of making judgments that they're good enough to continue.
Okay, I don't know that we need to be that specific, but I think we'll let Ms. Egan work on some language and we'll come right back to this. So I want to move to number 3 now, which was to prohibit out-of-state placement for youth, especially young women. Although if we're going to do it for everybody, they will include them, except in cases where the region location will benefit the youth. Build up programs in Maryland based on our population needs and support rehabilitation close to home. So I'm not sure, and I know, Nate, you did not write these, but is this a prohibition of out-of-state placements with an exception. Because it doesn't seem clear, the region location. Does that refer to the regions within Maryland, or are we talking about an exception to out-of-state placements for the benefit of the youth?
So I think that, there were two different things. I think that the point was to make an expectation that young people are in the state of Maryland and not sent out of state, and that we should be in whenever possible building the supports within the state of Maryland for young people if they're going to be placed. So it's setting that as the expectation as opposed to where it's a possibility ease. But I sort of don't want to overstate the sort of intent behind it as opposed to what the recommendation says. But it's prohibiting out-of-state placement with an exception when there's just a reason why it would have to be there, as opposed to just, we like that program in this other state and instead of doing it right here in Maryland.
Could I ask, I'm not sure what the background is for this. I assume Maryland does currently place youth out of state. My question is, how many? Why? How much does it cost? How much would it cost in Maryland to develop the program in the that another state is doing in order to replicate it here? I just don't know the information on which this recommendation is based.
So we do place kids out of state. I have to look the number up, but the number is, it used to be around 100 kids out of state. It has been significantly lowered. And I think we're in the teens or lower at this point. Of course, I think the population across the board is very low. Prior to the pandemic, I think we were around 30 or 40 kids placed out of state, which is probably a more relevant number than what we see right now. And the way I read this is, I should say the requirements currently in existence are that we should not be placing youth out of state unless we've exhausted every other option. I know that is a paraphrase of the language, but generally we should not place anyone out of state unless that's the only option. So I don't know if this is, I think it's more of a sort of a policy statement against using out-of-state placements unless it's absolutely necessary, which may be restating the current law. I think this one is going to require a bit more looking into, and perhaps it might be worth our time to move on to one of the other recommendations rather than get hung up on this. I'm gonna just go ahead and make that move and move on to the number 4 recommendation, which is that we require all facilities that house Maryland's youthful residents, both department operated, department run, and contracted, to employ evidence-based programming that is focused on positive youth development. I think I have the same comment there about evidence-based. If we use language, if we can come up with language that gives us a little bit of room to employ innovative practices, I think this is something that I would support as well. And
agreed with that addition. It's a good addition.
Okay. And Jenny, just raise your hand if you've got that language ready.
I need 2 more minutes, but yes.
Okay. All right. Very good. So we're gonna have to wait on that language as well, unless anybody has any opposition to number 4. Okay, great. Number 5 on the list here is to establish requirements for adequate clinical mental health and positive youth development staffing that includes necessary education, training, and background in education, child development, social work, or equivalent fields. I want to open discussion on this. I'm going to maybe make some amendments to it right away before we start discussing. I think what we're talking about when we say requirements for adequate staffing is standards for which we would either hire or train our staff. So perhaps it should read that we establish standards for clinical mental health and positive well, is positive youth development staffing a term, or is it just basically that we want to use positive youth development as our feature?
As a framework.
As
Yeah.
a framework. Okay. All right. I'm going to set that one aside for a moment as well, because I think we need to wordsmith that. And Nate, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, because I've got so many others already working on that, to clean
Sure.
that one up a bit. And then the last one, require access to comprehensive educational programming. Any?
Could I add something here?
Yes, Senator West.
I was taken by the comments in our very first meeting by a fellow who had been through the system and had come out, and he complained that the programming that's offered, educational programming offered, is only college track programming. And he said, frankly, was not helpful to me, and it's not helpful to most of the students, because we know we're not going to college. We need the kind of programming that's going to help us in our lives. I don't know how we put that in here, but I think we should.
Well, I think number 6 takes care of that, doesn't it?
Well, I think that what Senator West is talking about is that you could say comprehensive educational programming, but it still could be limited to that college track programming. So perhaps an amendment to, say, require access to comprehensive educational and technical and vocational education programming.
Yes, I like that a lot.
Yeah, we have in our recommendations specific language around that's mapped onto the Department of Labor standards for technical vocational education, which is requiring every DJS facility and contracted program to offer technical and vocational education training. It's TVET is the technical term, with highly qualified teachers and on-the-job training.
So why don't we just, I know that we're on one list, but let's jump to that list and just take that language since it's there. And I think that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to just read it back to everybody. It says, require every DJS facility and contracted program to offer access to technical and vocational education and training with highly qualified teachers and on-the-job training. Okay, so number 6, I see now. Mr. Schellenberg, you were talking about number 6 on Ms. Egan's list, and not on this list. Got you. So we could take both of those up together, if that makes sense. Access to comprehensive educational training, or we just combine them into one recommendation regarding education.
Secretary Abed, and I'll just add that right now the compulsory attendance law blocks us from doing that, giving access to students. So just want to make that point.
Yes, and it's a good point to make, but I think for purposes of the recommendation, we can still say that, and that necessarily would mean to implement it, we would have to make changes to that law. And I think that would need to happen. So why don't we just take those up as 2 separate items, and let's take those together. So can I hear a motion on first, requiring access to comprehensive educational programming?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Okay. Let's call the roll on that, Jamie.
I got a question. I thought we were going to add the words "and technical and vocational" to education.
Yeah, I missed what Mr. Schellenberger was saying was that we had in Ms. Egan's recommendations 2 separate recommendations. One would be comprehensive education program, and the second would be the vocational education as well.
Okay, so if we're going to, that's fine.
Running through the roll, actually, Secretary Abed, just wanted to point out, since the meeting began and roll was originally taken, I'm sure you already know because you've heard from most of these folks. Senator Carter, Senator West, and Senator Smith's aide, Luke Penton, had entered the meeting, and we also have Ms. Handy in the meeting.
Okay.
And calling the roll on the motion, Secretary Abed, I take it Mr. Penton was not going to be voting for Senator Smith?
I think that's appropriate. So let's just go with members that are present.
Okay. Senator Carter.
Yes.
Senator West.
Yes.
Delegate Clippinger.
Yes.
Delegate Jackson.
Yes.
Secretary Green.
Yes.
Ms. Tolentino.
Yes.
Mr. Kammer.
Yes.
Ms. Egan.
Yes.
Judge Stamm.
Abstain.
Dr. Gilball.
Yes.
Dr. Lawson.
Yes.
Dr. Sickman.
Yes.
Mr. Bayless.
Yes.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Yes.
Ms. Davis.
Yes.
Mr. Dodson.
Yes.
Ms. Handy.
Yes.
Mr. Campbell.
Yes.
Ms. Chapman.
Yes.
Mr. Fonseca.
Yes.
Mr. Houston. Mr. Houston might have stepped out of the meeting. Ms. Johnston.
Yes.
Mr. Ford.
Yes.
Deputy Secretary McGlone.
Yes.
And that's all members present were yes, with one abstention, Mr. Secretary.
Okay, great. Looks like we have that one passed. Can we hear a motion on requiring DJS facilities and contracted programs to offer technical and vocational education training?
So moved.
Seconded.
Jamie, we call the roll.
Oh, Mr. Secretary, I forgot to call you on the last one, but I assume you're a yes.
Yes.
Okay, so second vote, Senator Carter.
Yes.
Senator West.
Yes.
Delegate Clippinger.
Yes.
Delegate Jackson.
Yes.
Secretary Green.
Yes.
Ms. Tolentino.
Yes.
Mr. Kammerer.
Yes.
Ms. Egan.
Yes.
Judge Stamm.
Abstain.
Dr. Gilball.
Yes.
Dr. Lawson.
Yes.
Dr. Sickman.
Yes.
Mr. Bayless.
Yes.
Mr. Schellenberg,
Yes.
Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Dodson,
Yes.
Ms. Handy,
Yes.
Mr. Campbell,
Yes.
Ms. Chapman,
Yes.
Mr. Fonseca,
Yes.
I believe Mr. Houston is out of the meeting still. Ms. Johnston,
Yes.
Mr. Ford,
Yes.
Deputy Secretary McGlone,
Yes.
and Secretary Abed.
Yes.
That is all members present and voting yes, except for one abstention.
Okay, let me come back to some of the ones that we've got some work going on. Betsy, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Are you sure?
Yes, just just making one little change that I want to add in. So, okay. A young person, this is our motion. A young person may not be committed to the Department of Juvenile Services for an out-of-home placement if the most serious offense is a misdemeanor, if considered a misdemeanor, if committed by an adult, with the following exceptions. We would not, oh, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. Misdemeanor, I'm gonna need to start over. I screwed up, I apologize.
It's all right.
A
just
young
go ahead and
person may
start
not
it.
be committed to DJS for an out-of-home placement if the most serious offense is a misdemeanor, if committed by an adult, or for a technical violation of probation as defined by the Correctional Services article. The exceptions that we would like to include would be if the most serious offense is for the second adjudication of a handgun violation and 4-203 and 4-204 of the criminal law article, or for misdemeanor gun violations or firearm violations contained in the public safety article and the following statutes: 5-133, 134, 136, 138, 139, 140, 141, 142, and 144.
Mr. Chairman, can I just make a suggestion? I know you're trying to move it along, but this one's really important. Can we just defer the vote and so that people can actually look at this? I mean, I pulled out my book, but I can't look up all those statutes that quickly. I know Ms. Tolentino probably got it right, but I would really love to be able to look at this and make sure we covered everything, especially since I spend so much of my time voting against things. So I know I just saw Ms. Egan smile. So I just think this one's really important.
Mr. Secretary, I also wanted to point out, I think with a first violation of 5133 in public safety is probably going to include underage possession because they're prohibited from possession by virtue of their age. So I think you're, if you're doing a second offense for the 4203 and 4204 under criminal law, you're still going to get them with the first offense just by virtue of possession under 133.
Okay, and maybe there's a way just to simplify this. We're not trying to write a statute here. We're trying to make a recommendation, and perhaps we can just, simplify the language so it's not so technical, and just articulate what it is our policy view is, which is, I think doesn't have to be so exacting. So I'm going to let Betsy go ahead. Betsy.
I can do that, and I can rephrase. I think that we would cover everything if it read this way. And so if you just one more shot on the motion, I'll amend my current motion that's on the table, I guess, to have it read, a young person may not be committed to the Department of Juvenile Services for an out-of-home placement if the most serious offense is a misdemeanor if committed by an adult, or for a technical violation as defined in the Correctional Services article, except for second adjudications of any misdemeanor related handgun or firearm violation as contained in Maryland law.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any discussion before we call the roll? Jamie, go ahead and call the roll, please.
Senator Carter.
Yes.
Senator West.
No.
Delegate Clippinger.
Yes.
Delegate Jackson.
Yes.
Secretary Green.
I'll abstain. I just don't feel like I have enough information around those acts of violence.
Ms. Tolentino.
Yes.
Mr. Kammerer.
Yes.
Ms. Egan.
Yes.
Judge Stamm.
I'll abstain.
Dr. Gilball.
Yes.
Dr. Lawson.
Yes.
Dr. Sickman.
Yes.
Mr. Bayless.
Yes.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Yes.
Wait, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Nobody could believe it. Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Yes.
Mr. Dodson.
Yes.
Ms. Handy.
Yes.
Mr. Campbell.
Yes.
Ms. Chapman.
Yes.
Mr. Fonseca.
Yes.
I believe Mr. Houston is still out of the room. Ms. Johnston.
Yes.
Mr. Ford.
Yes.
Deputy Secretary McGlone.
Yes.
And Mr. Secretary, I believe Delegate Pippi has entered the room during the vote.
Delegate Pippi, I don't know if you've heard enough of the discussion to enter a vote, but you're welcome to weigh in.
You know what? I apologize for being late, but I actually haven't. So I'm going to abstain for the time being, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
And last vote is Secretary Abed.
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, 1 no, 3 abstentions, and the remainder are yes on the vote.
Excellent. Okay, I want to move back to Ms. Egan and see if you're ready with language on your motion.
Yes. So I would make a motion to establish a plan to close DJS-run youth prisons and ensure every county has access to non-residential and residential community-based services that employ evidence-based, culturally competent programming. In order to provide quality evidence-based programming, Maryland should create an independent, unified, and coordinated inventory of services for children that measures each program for its efficacy and cost benefit.
Second.
Ms. Egan, would you mind sending that in a chat to me, just so I can
Absolutely. I was
put it in my
email,
Excel
but I'll
sheet?
do it.
Thank you. And just a moment, Mr. Secretary. Let me get ready for this one.
Sure thing.
And I'm ready for the roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Please proceed.
Could Ms. Egan read her proposal again? She read it quite quickly.
And I'll read it slower. I realize I did it in my normal frenetic voice.
I might suggest if you've got it typed out, Ms. Egan, you're able to do a share screen on the presentation as well.
Sorry, can you see or not see?
Well, we can see your email inbox.
Oh, that's great.
Why
Please stop looking at that. Sorry about that. How's that?
There we go. Could you make could you make it a bit wider on the right edge? Some of the words are cut off.
Yes, sorry about that. You guys are taking up that part of my screen.
There we go.
Could I ask what the ramifications of the first 8 words of this proposal are?
So I think Senator West, you've touched on some language. It's a little bit different than where we started, which was I think on the Kids Are Kids document, it was establish a plan to create regional community-based model. And so I think we've got a plan to close DJS run youth prisons. I think that the sentiment
that was the combination of the two recommendations. Yeah. Which
what does that mean? What are DJS run youth prisons? Are we talking about all of the committed facilities that DJS currently runs throughout the state?
DJS currently has 5 committed youth placements, all of which are in Western Maryland. Victor Cullen, the youth camps, Garrett Children's Center, and what's Carter called now? Mountain View. The current average daily population today at those 5 facilities is 35 children. So we're currently running 5 facilities at $18 million a year that are serving an average daily population of 35 kids. The argument is, from my perspective, is that those things are better served in a regional. So you'll notice that this says close those youth prisons to open up residential options in communities. It is not to say that there would be no residential options, but that those residential options would no longer be the outdated, aging DJS youth prisons that are in remote Western Maryland.
Ms. Egan,
Secretary, can I ask a question?
may I ask a question too? Sorry.
Okay, well, I can't see who was asking first. I see Mr. Campbell. Do you have a question? And then the other person can go next.
Sure. You said thank you, Ms. Secretary. You said the average population is 35. Are you talking about per facility or for the entire state?
Right now, for the entire state, for all 5 facilities, the average daily population has been below 40 since July. But the average daily population, even pre-COVID, was, you're going to have to correct me, but around 100 kids was the average daily population. I believe all DJS youth prisons in fiscal year 2019 served 350 commitments. I don't know, I think it was 308 children total. So we're talking about very costly, very remote facilities that have a lot of other challenges, right? So the other challenges are that it's hard to get the qualified mental health professionals to serve in Garrett County, just because it's such a small county. It only has a population of 11,000 people, but it's got a number of DGS facilities. So when I say 35 kids, I'm saying we're running 5 youth prisons right now that have a total of 35 children in them.
Well, I'm glad I asked my question and stopped the vote, because I think these first 9 words are worth some investigation and some extended discussion, rather than simply a quick snap vote to close down most of DJS's facilities across the state.
Ms. Egan, I would maybe suggest a language change to say, establish a plan to transition from DJS's current I don't know the correct word, but the current slate of committed facilities to ensure every county has access to non-residential and residential community-based services. Or maybe to a model that ensures. I mean, I know the language isn't quite there, but I think that the sentiment is to move away from the current model of facilities, generally out in Western Maryland, to a model where we would have residential and non-residential services available in each county.
And
somehow the word plan got deleted, which I think it needs to be in there.
Sam, you mentioned in each county, so we're going to close down the 5 facilities in Western Maryland that are out there, lay off all those employees who run those facilities. And we're going to now build facilities in every county in the state to, again, I'm not prepared to vote on something like this with no discussion and no exploration of its ramifications.
Mr. Secretary, if I may.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I had a comment waiting. It was Delegate Pippi, by the way, but Secretary Bed, make sure you get me on the list there.
Absolutely. Betsy and then Delegate Pippi.
From my reading of this, I think the most important word really is a plan, and developing a plan that, we would have to evaluate how that plan could be implemented. But I think the first step to really looking at whether or not we can sort of realize what our current statutory framework really asks us to do is developing that plan and seeing what would it take to lift up sort of a close to home model in Maryland. So to me, I think this is the most reasonable first step to further investigate, what a plan would look like in the future.
Can I also say, I think Senator West's concern about each county is valid, in that 35 kids is not enough for a facility in every 24, a residential facility in every 24 counties. I wonder if the amendment just to region rather than county would be appropriate. So I'm going to read out this amended and just say that I would amend my proposal to say, establish a plan to transition from DJS's current slate of committed facilities to ensure every region has access to non-residential and residential community-based services that employ evidence-based culturally competent programming. And the second paragraph remains unchanged.
Well, could I ask another question? Let me just give you an example. Suppose a 17-year-old who is part of a drug gang was convicted of murder. Does this provide that that person will now be placed in some sort of a group home or something without fences around it, where he would be able to walk around the facility each day?
Chris, more likely than not, he's in the Division of Correction.
All right, well, Scott, let's assume he's too young for that. Let's go to, what, a 16-year-old?
We've convicted 16-year-olds for violent crime, and they're in Division of Correction. Nicholas Browning was 15 when he committed his murder, and he's out at North Branch. So I don't want to shock you all, but I actually don't have a problem with this. Now, I agree, Chris, there's going to be a huge fiscal note to this. But, you know, that doesn't mean that it can't be planned. I think that is the key. Ms. Egan is correct, or whoever, the key word is planned.
Okay.
Yeah, agreed. I think this is about, like, how would you do it? You gotta, you know, it would be a recommendation that we would have to come up with a plan. That doesn't mean that we have the plan. We certainly don't have a plan at this point.
I would just add that other states have been doing this, starting with a plan. And the state of Connecticut did it in conjunction with raising their upper age to age cohorts. So it is possible to do.
I'll also note that I don't support this, but there are ways to have secure facilities that aren't large congregant youth prisons, right? So say the young respondent that you're talking about, Senator West, was a 13 or a 14-year-old person. Having them in a secure youth prison may not be the solution, but they could be in a secure group home situation, right? They could be in a secure setting that is much more smaller, much more home-like, and much more therapeutic, addressing their everyday needs.
Okay, so we have, I think, the language of emotion.
Secretary, you didn't let me speak.
I'm sorry, Delegate Pippi, please. My apologies.
All right, it's okay. So to start off with, just kind of reiterating what Senator West is alluding to, what was presented initially was the intent to close all the facilities without any discussion, and it was justified because of the low enrollment numbers now because of COVID. I mean, this needs to be, if anything, a study. I mean, I'm not opposed to reviewing this, but that doesn't seem the intent of the people that want to push this through very quickly here. I mean, it seems clear that, you know, in one of these districts, or I'm sorry, one of these facilities, Victor Coleman is in my legislative district in Frederick. So, I mean, there needs to be more robust discussion of if we're transitioning out of these facilities. I mean, I heard the argument that there was 35 people enrolled on average at $18 million of cost, but then you're proposing that we spend tens of millions of dollars in building new facilities. I mean, that's not a good argument. So, you know, I'd like to kind of unpack this more before we're just arbitrarily throwing votes out there on closing down all the facilities in the state.
Well, let me, Mr. Kemmerer, go ahead.
So to Delegate Pippi and Senator West, I think that some of your concerns may be misplaced. I think that the fiscally conservative thing to do in this situation, where you're spending, you know, 18 million to house 35 kids, or even if it's 300 kids, is to do just this, to close large prisons staffed by 300 guards that are really unnecessary. That's almost a 10-to-1 ratio of guards to, you know, detainees. And to Mr. Schellenberger, I really do think that you're wrong about a fiscal note. I think over time, probably fairly quickly, the savings could be extraordinary. And nobody's talking about building new facilities. There's existing, you know, buildings throughout the state on a regional basis that can be used, repurposed for these kids. So I think the fiscally conservative thing to do under the circumstances and the thing that'll have better return on investment in terms of reducing recidivism is to adopt just what this language does suggest. I also think that it's just a plan, right? It's not, by date certain in 2022, have closed every prison in, everybody's district. It's just establishing a plan, and it's moving to region, which is best practices.
Listen, I appreciate your sentiment, and I appreciate the cute reference to fiscal conservative to the two Republicans on the committee. But I will tell you, if I actually thought this was about that, then we could talk about that. But I don't think it's in relation to saving money. I think there's a clear intent here to just close the facilities and to push people into programs that likely don't even exist. So, I mean, that's why we need to unpack this and have a real robust discussion onto reality. And look, this is not a plan. The language that was put out here was to close it. So, I mean, that's clearly the intent, of this motion. So, I mean, it's right there. I mean, we don't have the fiscal conservative this or that. I mean, that's not what we're talking about here.
So Delegate Pippi, I'll just address that straight on. I was given a very short amount of time to marry two recommendations, and clearly that is OPD's recommendation. But this is not the first time, and Secretary Abed expressed this, that and there's a long history. So I just wanted to say that there's a long history of commitments and conversations around policy to moving to something that previously was referred to as regionalism, right? Not that there is no residential. In fact, this language would require a residential option in every region. But not that it's not residential, but that we move towards a best practices. And part of that best practices, or the reason that the issue is that best practices for youth correctional facilities are that they are close to communities, so that not just children can receive treatment, so that families can be engaged in that treatment over long periods of time. That can't happen right now. For example, when a child that I represent is sent to Victor Cullen, there's no way by public transportation for a parent to get there for regular family therapy to really address those underlying issues. There's staffing concerns, especially with those being able to keep quality mental health and professional staffing in these remote placements. So just so you know, I don't want to close all youth prisons and have no place for my young people to go, so it's easier to transfer them into the DOC. That's not the goal. The real goal is to create evidence-based quality treatment programs so that when we take a child out of their home, what we do is provide them the real things that work. We know there are programs that work. And we know the thing that works for kids, if you have to take them out of their home, this doesn't stop us taking kids out of their home. If you have to take them out of their home, they should be in small, home-like environments with intensive wraparound therapeutic and educational opportunities. And so just to be frank, the idea that we would remove all programs that would take kids out of their home would hurt my clients who are in the greatest jeopardy, and that is not the goal.
So I'm going to just note that we're 9 minutes over our time right now. And so and one last thing, and I'll take the privilege of chair and have the last word here. The current law requires the department to have a regionalized system of services. So this would be consistent with the current law. All it would do is push us a little bit forward to say, all right, it says you have to have regionalized services. So now come up with a plan. That's how I read this. And so with that, we have a motion. Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Okay.
Secretary, could we adopt this by voice vote since we're over time? Maybe anybody who wants to against it could have their vote.
Yeah, let me ask Jamie if that's acceptable.
It's up to you, Mr. Secretary.
Okay, yeah, let's go by voice vote, or let me ask this. Let me ask for those that are opposed to articulate their opposition.
Well, again, this proposes a very significant change in Maryland to close down 5 facilities, lay off all the employees, spend a lot of money, a plan to to close facilities, lay off all the employees, spend tens of millions of dollars building new facilities around the state. We've discussed this for a grand total of maybe 15 minutes. I would move to defer any vote until at least the next meeting, so we can think about this and look into the ramifications of this before we vote on it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thank you for those concerns. However, the motion's been made and been seconded. And I'm sorry, let's just go ahead and call the roll. We're not going to do a voice vote. Call the roll, Jamie.
Senator Carter,
Yes.
Senator West,
No.
Delegate Clippinger,
Because I think we need evidence-based solutions, yes.
Delegate Jackson,
Yes.
Delegate Pippy,
No.
Secretary Green,
Secretary Green's left the meeting. You can move on.
Ms. Tolentino,
Yes.
Mr. Kemmerer,
Yes.
Ms. Egan,
Yes.
Judge Stamm,
Abstain.
Dr. Gilball,
Yes.
Dr. Lawson,
Yes.
Dr. Sickman,
Yes.
Mr. Bayless,
Yes.
Mr. Schellenberger,
Based upon the presentations given and the documents supplied, my answer is yes.
Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Mandel. Oh, excuse me. I forgot she wasn't in the meeting. Mr. Dodson,
Yes.
Ms. Handy,
Yes.
Mr. Campbell,
Yes.
Ms. Chapman,
Yes.
Mr. Fonseca,
Yes.
Mr. Houston is no longer in the room. Ms. Johnston,
Yes.
Mr. Ford,
Yes.
Deputy Secretary McGlone,
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, we have 2 abstentions, 2 noes, and the remainder are yes. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Secretary, what was your vote?
I'm a yes vote as well.
And as I said, 2 abstentions, 2 noes, and the remainder are yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, obviously, we have a lot of other recommendations we were not able to take up today, so we're going to have to move those to the next meeting. We'll send notifications out about the agenda and how it will be have to be amended in order to accommodate those. And so I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Okay, without any opposition, I will consider the meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.